again, everyone. This week in my English 750 class, which is called Topics in Textual Criticism, Information, Literacy, and Revolution Across the 14th Century, we return to the Golden Legend, which is a collection of saints' hagiographies originally written in Latin in the 13th century. So I'll preface this video by saying they'll be a little different from my past ones. With this video, I'm not providing what you might call a literary criticism, but instead thinking about how the different versions and translations of the Golden Legend might impact our modern day text itself. Therefore, we're moving from not necessarily the content within the text, but how that content came to be, and what physical texts or even oral speech might have contributed to it. This will hit on the textual criticism part of the class title, which is honestly a topic that is rather confusing and difficult to understand for me. So, for everyone out there that didn't really know what textual criticism meant, which is admittedly me, the definition is, quote, textual criticism is a branch of textual scholarship, philology, and literary criticism that is concerned with the identification of textual variants or different versions, or either manuscripts or of printed books, end quote. Additionally, in my other graduate classes, we've been learning about process pedagogy and also writing to learn, and the idea that writing is epistemic. So perhaps I've internalizing the writing to learn aspect, and I'm trying to do that myself as I work through this topic. I got the idea for this video from a recent conference, the Kentucky Philological Association conference, where some of my classmates described that writing to learn helped them work through difficult medieval texts and ideas surrounding them. So I figured I'd give it a go with this. So, the Golden Legend seems to be just an amalgamation passed down from oral stories, ancient scrolls, multiple different versions, that were all collected into one tale to have some kind of uniform document about the saints' lives, starting with Jacobus de Voragen's Latin version, the Legenda Aurea. However, since there have been countless reprints and translations, to say nothing of the original source material, it's difficult to understand the full complexity and roots of this text. What is missing from the oral stories that didn't get included in the text? And what influence did translators and printers, such as William Caxton, who we talked about in my first video, have on the Golden Legend, especially when different versions are merged together, which could occasionally leave out pertinent information? I began to think what all has been just lost to history. With all of this, how do we even know that the text we have now keeps the spirit of the original text, or even the oral stories, alive? I mean, some of the stories involve Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene and various apostles, showing that this definitely has to be based in oral tales or documents from 2,000 plus years ago. Wow. For me, the textual history of the Golden Legend started to just get increasingly confusing and overwhelming, especially considering all these different printed versions and translations. So I'm personally reading the 1998 Penguin edition of the Golden Legend, and I began to wonder quite a few things about it. Is this based on Caxton's English edition? Or did someone else translate Jacobus's original Latin version directly into English for this version? What about that French version? And then that other English version? What about all those other versions? What about the ancient scrolls or historical documents that could contribute to this? Or the over 1,000 Latin manuscripts of the Golden Legend that survive? And how are each of those 1,000 manuscripts different? And what about those original oral stories? So geez, that's a lot. And are there traces of all of these in my 1998 edition? And if each printer makes small changes or adaptations for hundreds of years, isn't the text going to slowly change like a game of telephone? This is also to say nothing about how translations might alter the text too, as we are trusting the translators are 100% competent and have picked words that retain and honor the original meaning of the message. I never thought about it before, but can you truly trust translators? If we're using work a translator did from decades or even centuries ago, how do we even know that person did a good job? A modern translation might be based on the work of a competent and credentialed translator, but what happens if they're working off a flawed text from the past? For example, the moves Caxton made when putting together his translation and version of the Golden Legend in 1483 didn't always make sense to me. He was working off of multiple prior versions of the text in Latin, French, and English, and sometimes made his entries shorter than the source material, potentially leaving out pertinent information. And if two of the sources differed, that means we had to rely on Caxton's judgment on what information to use. What sort of rhyme and reason do translators and compilers of these texts use? For that question, what sort of method did Jacobus use when compiling the original Latin version, that Legenda Ora? How do we know there weren't parts that he left out entirely too? I just have so many questions about all this. Though, I've thought about different versions in terms of like a early modern drama text, such as differences between like a folio and a quarto version, which is easy enough to understand. I've never had to think about it to this degree before. It's kind of hard to wrap my head around, especially since in our modern day, we don't have to think about all these unknowns. We have consistent records and documentation that the Middle Ages didn't have, or that simply didn't survive. For modern texts, we know who wrote the material, where it came from, and when, which is totally different than manuscript culture or early print culture for that matter. It's just absolutely bonkers to me to think that records just simply didn't survive or didn't exist, giving us only a partial or a skewed picture. However, as I think about it more, maybe our modern texts are more complicated than I am giving them credit for. Perhaps some of the popular stories today, or definitely the stories of early modern drama, are based in tales that have been told for centuries or longer, most of the time also probably through oral means, so they could have this complicated past. So I just started a bard in Dungeons & Dragons, so maybe it's good that I'm learning about all this now. So, returning to my version, the 1998 Penguin edition, I decided that I was going to do some investigating, and that's really what this entire video is about. Figuring out the history and roots of what I'm reading, if at all possible, but there's just so many questions. So, my book is now obviously not the Caxton English version because it was translated by a gentleman named Christopher Stace, a translator that's been working with classical texts and translations for over 30 years, which is a good sign. However, does this mean he translated it straight out of the original Latin version of the text for this version? Apparently not, as according to the translator's note, he predominantly used a modern Latin version of a text that was created in 1846 by translated and created by Johann Georg Theodor Gries. I hope I'm saying his name right, who was a German bibliographer and literary historian. And if more than 1,000 manuscripts in Latin of Jacobus's original text exist, why is Stace relying on this modern edition? Are the original texts widely different from one another, difficult to read, or in a version of Latin that is more difficult to read than modern Latin, such as maybe Old English or Middle English is to modern English? Perhaps my confusion is coming from the word manuscript, in the fact that 1,000 manuscripts of Jacobus's original text survived. With this, I thought it meant 1,000 different handwritten copies of his text that people, I assume those connected to Christianity and monasteries, created, maybe something like a scroll or a codex, since it was still the 1200s, before printing came out. However, maybe by manuscript it means the versions I'm finding in the mid-1300s and 1400s prior to actual printing in the original text. Some of those I've been finding are indeed codexes, but I couldn't find one much older than that. So does this mean that Jacobus's original text has been lost? How do these versions that are 100 or 200 years later differ from the original? All of my same questions about translations in different versions still exist here too. But at least I can't find any pictures or information about an original manuscript from him, or even codex prior to 1350, which is some 75 years after Jacobus penned his work. So, as a final point about this, about the not necessarily known nature of translators, the copyright page of my book also states, quote, "The moral right of the translator and editor have been asserted," end quote. And I was thinking, moral right? What does that even mean? So according to the Harvard Law School, quote, "The term moral rights is a translation of a French term and refers not to morals as advocated by the religious right, but rather to the ability of authors to control the eventual fate of their works. An author is said to have the moral right to control his or her work. The concept of moral rights thus relies on the connection between an author and his or her creation," end quote. Therefore, since translators ultimately have control over their work, there's not really a way to know if one translator's opinion would or wouldn't line up with another. So, throughout this investigation, I've deduced that Jacobus's original text from the 1200s likely doesn't exist anymore, which is incredibly sad. Or if it does exist, it's in such a state that prevents translators and scholars from working directly from that text. However, even though I've referred to this as an original text, it's really just a collection of stories and tales that were already written down in different pieces and being told orally. This is not to discount Jacobus's hard work, though, especially in an era where finding and compiling information must have just been incredibly difficult. However, how does this differ terribly from what Caxton did, which is compiling together different versions of a story that he had access to into one version? I suppose what Jacobus did was get all these singular stories into one codex, whereas Caxton took several books, manuscripts, or codexes and merged them into just one book. So throughout this, I've also learned that translating is not as straightforward as I imagined. It's not simply that Stace took the original Latin text and then translated into English, but he had to work really hard by using a variety of versions, many of which were incorrect or incomplete, and make decisions and mergers to form a full English text. He even states that many of the versions he used were, quote, "less than satisfactory, plainly corrupt, made no sense, or were suspect," end quote. He ultimately had to work with 14 different versions from 1846 to 1988, spanning a variety of languages, to make this 1998 version that I'm reading. Stace even sometimes had to refer to other hagiographies and relevant literature to fill in the gaps, sometimes even relying on Caxton's English translation too. It's interesting to note that Stace states that Caxton, quote, "clearly had access to sources not available to modern editors," end quote, continuing to show the unfortunate fact that some documents have been forever lost. It's interesting that Caxton and Greece's versions are also very different from one another, as stated by Stace in his introduction, showing the great variety between the centuries, versions, and even available information. Due to all the information in this video, it's difficult to understand how close my 1998 version is to the original text penned by Jacobus or even the original oral stories. I'm gathering that over the years that translators and printers have done the best they could to reproduce the text with the resources and versions available. But there's no doubt that my version must differ in significant ways, either by adding or subtracting information, or maybe even certain elements are skewed. I suppose this is the plight of those who study medieval literature, as I'm now finding. Well, anyway, thank you for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time. Goodbye.